The first time I saw a little boy die in front of me, I froze. The second time I brought him back. And the woman screaming his name while I pressed my hands against his tiny chest had no idea that I was the same man her company had quietly destroyed 3 years earlier. She didn't know that I recognized her the second she stepped out of that black SUV wearing a tailored coat and diamond earrings. She didn't know I had spent nights hating her, blaming her, imagining what I'd say if I ever saw her face to face again. But none of that mattered when her son collapsed on the cold pavement outside that charity gala and turned blue in my arms. I can still hear her crying while everyone else stood there panicking, too afraid to touch him, and I can still remember the moment she looked at me afterward with tears in her eyes and whispered, "You saved my son." What she didn't know was that her company had ruined my life long before I saved hers. So tell me honestly, if you were in my position, would you have helped her child after everything she had done to you? 3 years earlier, my life looked completely different. My wife Elena was alive then. We lived in a tiny apartment above a laundromat with our 6-year-old daughter Sophie. We didn't have much, but we laughed a lot. Elena used to dance while cooking dinner, pulling Sophie into the kitchen while music played from an old speaker with static crackling through it. I worked as a paramedic in Chicago, and Elena worked nights at a bookstore cafe. We were exhausted all the time, but we were happy. At least I thought we were untouchable back then. I thought love alone could protect a family from anything. Then Elena got sick. It started with headaches, then fainting spells, then came the MRI, the sterile hospital room, the doctor avoiding eye contact, brain tumor, aggressive, operable but expensive. I remember Elena squeezing my hand while the doctor explained treatment options, but all I could hear was the number. The surgery alone cost more money than I had ever seen in my entire life. I picked up every overtime shift possible. I stopped sleeping. I sold my truck. Elena sold her wedding ring when she thought I wasn't looking. We still came up short. That was when the company stepped in. Or at least that's what I believed at first. The ambulance service I worked for had just been acquired by a massive healthcare corporation owned by a woman named Vanessa Whitmore. She was one of those CEOs people wrote magazine articles about, young billionaire, self-made, ruthless but brilliant. Every business podcast treated her like royalty. The company promised better healthcare coverage, employee assistance, emergency hardship grants. I remember sitting in the HR office filling out forms while Sophie colored beside me. I truly believed help was coming, but 2 weeks before Elena's surgery, my request was denied, not delayed, not reviewed, denied. I begged them to reconsider. I explained everything. I told them my wife would die without treatment. The HR representative wouldn't even look at me while she read from a prepared statement about budget restructuring. Then, because life apparently enjoys kicking people when they're already drowning, layoffs started. Hundreds of employees cut overnight. I was one of them. I walked home in the freezing rain carrying a cardboard box with my uniform folded inside it. Elena knew the second she saw my face. I tried to stay strong, but I broke down right there in the kitchen while Sophie slept in the next room. Elena died 4 months later, and after the funeral, it was just me and Sophie. People love talking about grief like it's poetic, but there's nothing beautiful about it. Grief is dirty dishes piling up because you can't move. It's hearing your kid cry herself to sleep because she misses her mother. It's pretending everything is okay while your chest feels hollow. I worked construction during the day and drove rideshare at night just to keep us afloat. Every morning Sophie asked if I was tired, and every morning I lied. Then one night, everything changed again. I was driving home after a 12-hour shift when I spotted smoke pouring from a duplex 2 blocks away. People stood outside screaming. Without thinking, I ran inside. Training doesn't disappear just because your job title does. I found an elderly man unconscious near the stairs and dragged him out. Then someone yelled there was still a child inside. I went back in. I still remember the heat clawing at my skin and the sound of wood cracking above me. I found the little girl hiding under a bed. She couldn't have been older than 5. I wrapped her in my jacket and got her out seconds before the ceiling collapsed. The story ended up online. Local news called me a hero. I hated that word. Heroes don't fail their wives, but the attention led to a community health center offering me a job teaching emergency response classes. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was steady. More importantly, Sophie finally started smiling again. For the first time in years, life felt survivable. Then came the gala. The community health center received an invitation to provide medical staff for a high-profile charity event downtown. Wealthy donors, politicians, celebrities. I almost declined because I didn't own a decent suit anymore, but my supervisor insisted. Just stand there and look professional, he told me jokingly. I arrived early that evening and immediately felt out of place. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers. Women wearing dresses that probably cost more than my rent. I spent most of the night near the entrance pretending not to notice how invisible people like me become in rooms like that. Then I saw her, Vanessa Whitmore. She walked into the ballroom with a little boy holding her hand. He looked around 8 years old with dark hair and huge nervous eyes. Vanessa looked exactly like the magazine covers. Perfect posture, flawless makeup, cold elegance. The crowd practically parted for her, and the second I saw her face, every ugly memory came rushing back. My stomach twisted. My hands shook. I thought about Elena lying in that hospital bed. I thought about those rejection letters. I thought about Sophie asking why mommy wasn't waking up anymore. I wanted to leave, but then the little boy smiled at a waiter carrying desserts, and something about that tiny moment stopped me. Kids don't carry their parents' sins. About an hour later, I stepped outside for air. Snow drifted gently across the sidewalk while luxury cars lined the street. I heard laughter from inside the ballroom doors. Then I heard screaming. The little boy, Vanessa's son, was lying motionless near the curb. Everything happened fast after that. People panicked. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Vanessa dropped to her knees beside him, hysterical, shaking him and crying his name over and over. Ethan, Ethan, wake up. I pushed through the crowd instantly. Training took over. No pulse. His lips were turning blue. I started CPR immediately while another staff member called emergency services. Vanessa grabbed my arm, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Please save him, she begged. Please. And right there, in that frozen moment, I had a choice. The woman kneeling beside me was the same woman I had blamed for my wife's death. Part of me wanted to stand up and walk away. I'm ashamed to admit that thought crossed my mind. For one horrifying second, I thought about doing nothing. But Ethan's tiny hand twitched against my wrist, and suddenly all I could see was Sophie, so I kept going. 30 compressions. 2 breaths, agon, minutes felt like hours. The crowd had gone silent except for Vanessa crying behind me. Then finally, Ethan coughed violently and gasped for air. The entire street erupted. Vanessa collapsed against me, shaking uncontrollably while paramedics rushed in. She kept repeating, "Thank you," over and over like it was the only phrase her brain could still process. At the hospital later that night, I sat alone in the waiting room staring at coffee stains on the floor when Vanessa approached me. Her makeup was smeared. Her hands trembled. "He's stable," she whispered. I nodded without looking at her. Then she said something that caught me off guard. "You looked familiar earlier tonight." I finally met her eyes. "You fired me 3 years ago." Her expression changed instantly. Confusion first, then recognition, then guilt. "You worked for MedCorps Ambulance," she said quietly. "My wife died 4 months later because your company denied her treatment assistance." The silence between us felt suffocating. Vanessa sat down slowly across from me. For the first time, she didn't look powerful. She looked exhausted. "I didn't know," she whispered. I laughed bitterly. "That's the problem, isn't it? People like you never know." She didn't argue. And that should made me feel victorious, but it didn't. Because sitting there in that hospital waiting room, watching a terrified mother who had almost lost her child, I realized pain doesn't care about status or bank accounts. Grief destroys everyone the same way. Still, I wasn't ready to forgive her. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to really think about this situation and tell me honestly what you would have done. If the person you blamed for destroying your family suddenly needed your help, could you save them anyway? Could you look past your anger in that moment? Or would the resentment be too strong? Because sitting in that hospital, hearing that little boy breathing again down the hallway, I genuinely didn't know if I was a better person, or just too broken to hate her anymore. Pause for a second and comment what you would have done in my shoes. Vanessa asked if we could talk again after Ethan recovered. I almost refused. Every instinct told me to walk away and never see her again. But part of me needed answers. I needed someone to acknowledge what happened to Elena. A week later, I met Vanessa at a quiet coffee shop near the lake. No bodyguards, no assistants, just her. She looked different in daylight. Less polished, more human. She explained that during the acquisition years earlier, thousands of assistance claims had been outsourced to a private review board. She admitted she barely oversaw that department personally, because investors pressured her to focus on expansion and profits. When layoffs started, executives assured her the cuts were strategic. "I built something so big I stopped seeing individual people," she said softly. "And your family paid the price for that." I wanted to stay angry, I really did. But the grief in her voice sounded real. Then she told me something I never expected. Ethan had a congenital heart condition. The collapse outside the gala wasn't the first time it happened. He's technically alive because of experimental treatment, she said. Every day I'm terrified I'll lose him. For the first time, I saw the irony clearly. The billionaire CEO who could buy almost anything in the world still couldn't guarantee her child would survive. We talked for nearly 3 hours that day. About loss. About guilt. About the impossible choices people make when money and healthcare collide. Then she asked me the question that changed everything. What would you have done differently if you were me? Nobody had ever asked for my perspective before. Over the next few months, Vanessa kept contacting me. At first I assumed it was guilt, maybe charity, but eventually I realized she genuinely wanted to change things. She visited the community health center anonymously several times. She met struggling families. She listened instead of talking, and slowly, something unexpected happened. I stopped seeing her as the villain in my story. One evening she met Sophie. I was nervous about it, because Sophie still barely talked about Elena without crying. But Ethan came too. Carrying a board game under his arm, the kids bonded instantly. At one point I walked into the kitchen and found Sophie teaching Ethan how to make grilled cheese sandwiches, while Vanessa stood nearby laughing softly. And suddenly I had this strange, overwhelming feeling that Elena would have wanted me to let go of my anger. Not forget, never forget, but let go. A year after the gala, Vanessa launched a massive employee emergency fund program through her company. This time claims were reviewed directly by independent advocates instead of automated systems. She also reopened dozens of jobs lost during the restructuring years earlier. At the press conference announcing the changes, reporters kept asking her what inspired the decision. She looked directly at me standing near the back of the room and said, "Someone reminded me that numbers on paper are human beings in real life." I won't lie and say everything magically healed after that. There were still nights I sat alone missing Elena so much I could barely breathe. There were still moments resentment crept back in. Trauma doesn't disappear because life improves. But something incredible happened with Sophie. She started laughing again. Real laughter, the kind that fills a room. Vanessa arranged for Sophie to attend a private arts academy after learning how much she loved painting. I tried refusing at first, but Vanessa told me it wasn't charity. "It's an investment in someone extraordinary," she said. And Ethan, that little boy I brought back to life, became like family. One afternoon he asked me something that shattered me completely. "Do you think my mom was a bad person before you saved me?" Kids have a way of asking impossible questions. I told him the truth. I think sometimes people get so lost chasing success that they forget how much power they have over others. But I also think people can change. He nodded seriously like he was storing the answer somewhere important. Then he hugged me. A few months later, Vanessa invited me and Sophie to dinner at her home. I almost laughed when I saw the place because it looked like something out of a movie. Floor-to-ceiling windows, massive staircases, artwork worth more than entire neighborhoods. But the weird thing was, it didn't feel warm. Not until Ethan and Sophie started racing through the hallways, screaming with laughter. That night, after the kids went upstairs, Vanessa admitted something to me. "I was miserable long before you met me," she said quietly. "I just hid it better than most people." She told me her marriage had collapsed years earlier because her ex-husband cared more about public image than family. She confessed she spent most nights terrified Ethan would die while she sat helpless in another hospital room. Then she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "You saved more than my son that night." I didn't know what to say. Because somehow the woman I had once hated became one of the few people who truly understood my pain. And maybe that's the strangest part of this whole story. Healing came from the last place I expected. 2 years after the gala incident, the community health center expanded into a full emergency training foundation funded partly by Vanessa's company. She insisted on naming it after Elena, the Elena Ramirez Family Care Center. When I saw the sign unveiled for the first time, I completely lost it. I cried harder than I had in years. Sophie held my hand during the ceremony, while Ethan stood beside us wearing a tiny suit and grinning proudly. And in that moment, I realized something important. Saving Ethan didn't erase what happened to Elena. Nothing ever could, but hatred would have destroyed what remained of my life if I'd held onto it forever. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are carrying wounds we can't see. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about refusing to let pain turn you into someone you no longer recognize. And sometimes one decision, single moment where you choose compassion instead of revenge, can completely rewrite your future. Today Sophie is 14 and already selling paintings online. Ethan's heart condition is stable. Vanessa stepped down as CEO last year and now spends most of her time working directly with healthcare access programs. And me? I still teach emergency response classes. Every time I demonstrate CPR, I think about that freezing winter night outside the gala. I think about how close I came to making the wrong choice, because if I had walked away that night, Ethan would be dead. Vanessa would have buried her son. Sophie would never have found the opportunities she has now, and I probably would have spent the rest of my life drowning in bitterness. So no, I don't believe people are purely good or evil anymore. I think people are complicated, broken, capable of terrible mistakes and incredible redemption at the same time. And maybe that's the real heartwarming part of this whole story. Not that I saved a billionaire's son, but that saving him ended up saving me too. If you made it this far, I really want to know your opinion. Were you on my side? Would you have done the same thing in that moment? Let me know down in the comments because I read every single one. And if this story moved you at all, make sure you like this video. Subscribe for more stories like this, and share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you all in the next story.